So this is a little bit different. Slides instead of me and a silly t-shirt. But for the next couple of lectures, I have some diagrams and some slide content that I need to share with you. So we're going to do this a little bit differently. Um, we're going to do three quick lectures over the nature of structure. I've kind of broken it out into three parts. We're going to talk about the social self. The next lecture will cover groups and organizations, and then the last and institutions, and then the last lecture will cover social processes. Now, all of these are linked to a diagram or a model that exists in the chapter and in the outline, and there's even a handout version of it in Blackboard, called the nested hierarchical model of social structure and processes, which I know is a huge mouthful. But the nested hierarchical model of social structure and processes is exactly what it sounds like. It is a model of the social structures in sociology that we consider in sociology. It is also going to show us the processes that connect the individuals in society to the rest of those structures. And it will also, of course, feature a scenario in which increasingly larger structures contain the smaller structures that are kind of at the core of it. So that's what we mean by nested. So smaller things are contained within increasingly larger things. So, for example, if you've ever seen the little wooden nesting dolls that you can often buy if you're a tourist in Russia, for example, or if you have a set of mixing bowls, the smaller bowls fit within the larger bowls in a way that allows them to sort of sit on the shelf and take up less space because they are nested one within the other. So our model of social structure here is going to start with the smallest structures, in this case, the self, right? The self as a kind of social phenomenon. And as we move out and away from the self to increasingly larger social structures, we'll always be able to look back and see the self contained within the group, or we'll be able to see the groups contained within the organization, or we'll be able to see the organizations and the groups and the selves contained within the institutions. That's the nature of this nesting phenomenon. So without further ado, I guess then we'll get started and we'll look at the social self. So when sociology looks at the self, we're looking at it very differently than, say, for example, a psychologist might look at the self. We have a very different unit of analysis in sociology, right? We're interested in the collective. We're interested in the aggregate. Psychology is much more interested in the individual as an individual. But nevertheless, we do start an analysis of social structure with a consideration of the self, because it is possible to think about the self as a social structure. The definition that I'm going to give you today for self is kind of a placeholder. I want to put this out there now because I think we kind of need a definition for self. But it isn't until later in the semester that we're really going to dive into a more focused and a little bit more of a sophisticated way of looking at the self through a kind of sociological lens, in which case we'll abandon the definition that we're going to start with. But for now, this will be sufficient. And the definition that we're using comes out of an Introduction to Sociology textbook. I just pulled one off of the shelf one day, and this is what I found. And it's fairly typical, and it's not particularly remarkable or noteworthy, because, again, it's going to be something that you see in any Introduction to Sociology textbook. But here we're going to define it as a relatively organized complex of attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors associated with an individual. I would also like you to think about the self as a collection of statuses. Now, statuses are socially named positions, socially defined positions that people can occupy. So being a teacher or a student, a husband, a son or a daughter, an uncle or an aunt, a Cubs fan, right? So those are socially defined positions that people occupy. Statuses can be either ascribed or achieved. An ascribed status is one that is imposed on you, for lack of a better word. Right? So when your parents have another child, you become a sibling, right? That is a status that you occupy. You're now a brother or a sister or a sibling. Um, you didn't do anything to make that happen, right? That is a status that is kind of imposed on you as a result of the decisions or actions of other people. So things like our race, things like our status as a sibling, right? Your sex, some of these kind of immutable characteristics would fall into this category of ascribed status. An achieved status, on the other hand, is one that is achieved. You've done something to earn it. Um, Being a high school student requires that you pass through junior high school first, right? You earn sufficiently high grades so that you can then be promoted into high school. Or becoming a college student requires that you either have a graduate equivalency degree or a a high school diploma, right? You have to finish high school before you can go to college. Um, becoming a parent is an achieved status, right? You and your spouse have a child, or you adopt a child, and you go from being, a couple to being parents. That's an achieved status. So many times, not all the time, but many times, it's going to be really easy to identify a status as either ascribed or achieved. I would like to point out that sometimes a status can be both depending on particular circumstances. I'm thinking specifically of, say, for example, one's religious identity. When you are a child, your religious identity is most likely ascribed, right? You're going to probably be raised in whatever religious tradition your parents practice. You're going to get dragged to church, you're going to get dragged to temple or mosque or whatever. Um, at some point, though, you get to start making a choice. Sometimes it's mid adolescence, sometimes it's early adulthood. But at some point in your life, your religious identity ceases to be something that is ascribed and becomes something that's achieved. Now, many people just continue to practice in the tradition that they were raised, but some people change traditions, some people abandon religiosity altogether, right? So as adults, we would look at a person's religious identity and say that status as an atheist or a person with a religious belief like a Catholic or a Protestant or a Muslim or a Jew, that would be an achieved status. Right? So that's the way that works. Now, statuses are defined by their roles, right? And specifically, roles are the set of behaviors that accompany a particular status. So, my status as a teacher is really defined by the fact that I prepare content, I lecture to students, I evaluate exams and written work. Right? So the things that I do as a teacher are sort of what define me as a teacher. So selves, yeah, statuses and roles are always going to be interconnected. And it's going to be very important for you to keep that in mind. Now, there's a lot that happens at this level of social organization. When we look at social structure and we consider the individual kind of at the center of all of it, there really is quite a lot going on. There are smaller social phenomena than statuses and roles. We're not going to get into any of them, but there are some that are a little bit smaller. But we're really going to start here. So even though it's possible to imagine, say, individual behaviors sort of separated from and not specific to any role, um, as a kind of social phenomenon, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing, we're just going to start with statuses and roles and kind of go from there and build outward. But I do want to bring this up to make a point that at this level of sociological analysis, people are sometimes tempted to try to unravel the underlying intent of social behavior. The people try to ask why, right? Why do people do the things they do? And that is a question about motivation, and motivation's really kind of problematic for a sociologist. For a scientist in general, I think, because motivation can't really be falsified, right? We have no way of independently verifying the underlying intent that drives a person to engage in the behaviors they engage in. That is something that I think psychology is a lot more comfortable talking about than sociology is. So we're not going to talk about motivation, in part because it's not really possible for us to measure it. So it's kind of outside of our scope as a discipline that's empirically grounded. Um, but also because at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter, right? What matters isn't why a person does the things they do. What matters is what they do. And that has the advantage of both being observable, right? We can measure and we can document actual behavior in a way that we can't measure or document motivation. Again, you could ask a person why you did that, but whatever they tell you, you're not in a position to be able to verify whether in fact that is true or not. Right? It's a vocabulary, it's a narrative, but it isn't the same thing as an actual understanding of motivation. So we just sort of set that aside and we say, all right, let's just look at action. Let's just look at what it is that people do. And for a significant portion of our day to day lives, the things we do are going to be a reflection of the social expectations that are held of us, right? We move from status to status across the course of our day. In the morning, when I get up and I'm having my coffee, I'm sitting with my partner and I'm a spouse. I get in the car or I jump on the computer, I start interacting with students, and now suddenly I'm a teacher. Same biological organism, but a completely different status, and as a result, a very different set of behaviors. And when I'm done being a teacher, maybe I go into a meeting with the dean of my division. And at that point, I'm not a teacher, I'm a department chair. And the things that unfold in the context of that meeting look different than the things that I was doing in the context of being a teacher in a classroom. And that itself looks different than the things that I was doing as a spouse sharing a coffee in the morning with my partner. So most of the behavior that I'm going to engage in across the course of the day are the role behaviors that are specific to the particular statuses that I occupy. And that's why this sociological analysis of the self is going to focus on looking at the positions that a person occupies and the expectations that are attached to those positions, rather than sort of trying to unravel the underlying drive or intent of the person who's putting those actions into play. It's not that that isn't an interesting question. It's just a question for a different discipline. Right? Again, sociology is kind of focused on what's going on between individuals more so than what's going on with an individual. Um, I mentioned context, but let me say a couple of things real quick about that before we wrap this up. Um, Context is broadly defined. It consists of all of the features of the social world, right, the world around us, that are shaping and constraining the actions of individuals, of groups, and of organizations. So that is broadly speaking what we mean by context. When we are talking about um, when we are talking about selves, however, specifically thinking about the self as a collection of statuses, context becomes a little bit more immediate. It becomes a little bit more personal. So when we talk about context in relation to sort of interpersonal behaviors, we see that at that level, context kind of has three elements, right? Where you are, when you're there, and who you're with. So in a classroom, during class time, when the teacher is present, your behavior is going to reflect the behavioral expectations, the role of a student, because that is your status in that particular context. And if I'm standing in front of the class and I'm lecturing on content, it is because in that time frame, in that room with those social others, the status that is most relevant to that moment is my status as teacher, and my behavior is going to ultimately reflect that. Um, so again, where you are, when you're there, and who you're with. The answer to these 30 questions is going to go a long way toward explaining the behavior that you can observe a person engaging in. Um, we can see this sort of illustrated quite nicely. I know we're not actually in a classroom situation. We're taking this class online, but imagine being in a classroom. Class has begun. The instructor gets maybe 5 or 10 minutes into their lecture, into their presentation. They realize they've left something in their office, so they're going to excuse themselves for a few moments. They're going to leave the room, and the assumption, I think, fairly, is that at some point the instructor is going to be back. So students understand the class is not over, but the teacher has now left the room. So you're still in the classroom, you're still with your classmates, and you're there in the window of time between when class begins and when it is scheduled to end. But in the absence of a teacher, students may take out their phones. They may start talking amongst themselves. They might put their head down on their desk and try to get a few more minutes of sleep. Those are non-student behaviors, and students feel very comfortable engaging in those behaviors in this particular scenario because they understand that when the teacher leaves the room, they, in many ways, cease to be students, because you can't really be a student unless there's a teacher. And when I say you can't be a student, I mean it in the behavioral sense. You know, you can sit there attentively staring at the front of the room, waiting to hear some information so you can take some notes. But that behavior is going to look very strange if there's no one standing up there to deliver that content. Conversely, if all the students in my class got up and walked out at once, I would cease to be the teacher. It wouldn't mean I lose my job. It just means that, standing up there talking about the importance of context to the social self becomes an exercise in something other than teaching. It's just me speaking to an empty room. So we can use context here to make sense of the behavior of people around us. We don't really need to know anything about the individual person. We just need to know a little bit of information about the context, and specifically within that context, what status does this particular person occupy? And then if you know something about the status, then you're going to be able to predict their behavior. And this you can see the way in which this also kind of plays into that whole process of social construction of reality that we were talking about last time. So again, context is a really, really critical factor to take into consideration as you're doing sociological analyses. You could probably fairly say that one of the things that sociology is fairly consistent about is trying to place the behavior of humans in their contexts, because it is through understanding the context that we're going to be able to understand the behavior. Whether it is appropriate or inappropriate is really a question of understanding the context. So next time we're going to talk about structures larger than the individual self. So we're going to start moving out into a larger set of layers of society. We'll talk about groups, we'll talk about organizations, and we'll talk about institutions. But until then, take care, and I will see you next time.